Put the following ingredients into the bread machine pan in this order. One cup and 2 tablespoons of water. The important thing here is that the water should feel only slightly warm to your skin. If it's too hot or too cold, the dough will not rise properly. Does the water feel uncomfortable to you? That's how it's going to feel to the yeast too. Don't overlook this step. It can make the difference between a good crust and a bad crust. I live at a high altitude where this mix of water to flour works perfectly every time. However, I found that using this same mix at a normal altitude left me with a much wetter ball of dough than was desired. If you run into this, reduce the amount to 1 cup or even less on future tries until your dough ball has the right consistency to work with. 1/2 teaspoon of salt. The reason we put the salt in first and the yeast in last is because salt water kills yeast, so you want to keep them separate as long as possible. 1/2 teaspoon of sugar. If you're diabetic, maybe consider using Splenda or some other substitute. When using sugar, you don't want to go overboard or use much more than 1/2 teaspoon. Remember that sugar is essentially fuel. It burns. The more sugar you use when cooking at high temperatures, the faster the crust will burn. One of the local pizza chains in my home state of Colorado uses honey in the crust, which gives it a crunchier consistency on the outside and a pleasantly bitter taste after it's cooked. One of Colorado's big exports is honey, so I guess that's what characterizes a Colorado pizza. If you decide to use honey, I've used as much as a tablespoon without running into any problems. Just know that you might end up with a stickier dough that will require more flouring later to work with. 2 tablespoons of olive oil. You could just as easily substitute vegetable or corn or canola oil, but how Italian would that be? Olive oil, especially extra virgin, imparts a distinct flavor to any crust or bread made with it, and it's a lot healthier than other oils. The function of oil in dough is to literally lubricate the flour to enable it to rise higher and wider. You only want enough oil to meet that purpose. 3 level cups of white all-purpose flour or bread machine flour. I've tried both kinds and I really can't tell any difference. Plain old gold medal will do just fine. If you use whole wheat flour, you may get different results and will probably need to cook it longer. I'm not a fan of whole wheat, but it's definitely healthier for you. Two and a half to 3 teaspoons active dry yeast. I make quite a bit of pizza, so I always buy yeast by the jar instead of packets. It needs to be stored in a refrigerator. Yeast is basically bacteria that comes to life in warm water and gives off the gas that makes bread bread and seizes your mind when you inhale it. You'll see yeast labeled bread machine, but there's no meaningful difference. Yeast does go bad over time, so don't keep it beyond its expiration date. Some other things I throw in from time to time are 1 to 2 tablespoons oregano or oregano powder. Garlic powder, onion powder, Once all the ingredients are in, select the dough cycle on the bread machine and start it. It will run its knead cycle in spurts at first, then do a spin and toss cycle for a while. My machine does its spin and toss cycle for 30 minutes before it goes to its rise cycle, which we will not use. Watch the dough ball. Once it has formed smoothly, scrape any sludge out of the corners with a rubber spatula. Then spray the sides and bottom of the bin lightly with PAM or some other spray oil, olive oil preferred, so that you have a nice neat ball bouncing around. When the spin and toss cycle stops, it's time to move the dough to rising bowls. If you want to make 2 thin crust pizzas, you can now cut the dough ball in half and use 2 bowls. First, you want to spray another thin layer of spray oil over the bottom and sides of the bowl. Drop the dough ball into the center, then spray over the ball itself with the spray oil. The reason that we do this is because if there's any dry spot in the bowl, the dough will get hung up on it as it expands and it will not expand as well. Also, the outer surface of the dough ball itself needs lubricant to be able to stretch while being exposed in air for an hour. Cover the bowl with a paper towel or a towel and allow to rise for 1 hour. What I do is put the bowl atop the bread machine because it will still be running its rise cycle and it will be giving off a slight bit of heat, just enough to give the dough a boost. The reason we don't let the machine rise the dough on its own is because of the shape of the bucket. We want a large round ball of risen dough so that we have to work with it as little as possible before cooking it. Tired and elastic dough is nice for thin crust pizzas and anyone skilled enough to hand toss them, but what we want in my recipe is a higher crust with a bread-like consistency in the center layer. The idea is for each slice to be a meal so that you don't have to make several pizzas to feed everyone. You can also use this time to wash out the bread pan. I make it a point to clean as I go so that I'm not left with this huge overwhelming mess at the end.